Hello, everyone. I'm Ace Ehrlich, and I'm here today with Meredith Bays and Michael Henry Hayden, whose wonderful exhibition, Waiting for the Canyon's Echo, is open for another week until March 20th here at Moskowitz Bays in Los Angeles. Michael, to start on a sort of general note, I was wondering if you might be able to tell us just a little bit about the subject matter of the show, and of course, the general process that you use to make most of these works, because I think they sort of tie into one another in a really lovely way.
Sure. So most of the work in this show takes its starting point as casts made directly from mostly natural elements, either in my immediate environment where I live, houseplants that I grow, and my partner, Anthony Lepore, who's an excellent gardener, and also based on rock and tree casts from the natural world, mostly in the Angeles forest behind Los Angeles, where we like to hike a lot. And onto those forms, I've recast them in the studio and combined them with different elements, geometric forms, or more domestic references to make compositions that speak to the experience of experiencing those spaces, even though the objects themselves only include these very specific bits of that larger space. This piece on the screen is called Studio Gate and combines a cast fragment of a monstera leaf that I'm growing at home with the gate of my studio, which has this crisscrossing form, and each of the objects, both the painted surface that has the gate, is sort of mapped over with the cutout forms that are part of the leaf. And then the leaf itself has an image of the gate painted onto it. So it creates this dialogue between these two very different forms that speak to the similarity between the two, the green color and the cutout negative spaces. Maybe we could go to the next slide.
So Michael, many of the works engage these forms that you refer to as scrolling casts. I'm curious if you can just speak a little bit to what that means and how you use them throughout the show.
Sure. So some of these works are made with a technique where I paint a rubber mold around a three-dimensional object. This one, Thicket, for instance, is based on a braided money tree. And that's a small house plant that has actually been braided as it was cultivated. I'm making a rubber mold around the form. And as I finish the mold, I begin to peel part of it off, but I continue the mold around the form. So I'm constantly peeling the mold as I'm continuing the mold. And it results in this long, repetitive form that repeats all the details of the object, the original object, multiple times on one continuous, seamless surface. And I was originally inspired by looking at plywood and observing how a single piece of wood would have the same knot visible multiple times, and trying to find a way to make an analog of that that was three-dimensional. So several pieces in the show use that technique. This one, called Topiary, takes that same form that was originally three-dimensional, continues it into this long two-dimensional flat mold, and then turns it again back into an original three-dimensional object, this time much larger than the original source material.
And I think, well, you just showed this picture of one of your earlier door paintings, Michael, and I think that's an interesting sort of segue to maybe have you discuss the feeling of temporality, I think, that has carried from that last body of work, these wonderful door paintings, into your current body of work. And I think that sort of notion of time as a kind of organizing factor in the sculpture is important to go into, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So these paintings were all similarly formatted. The composition, three-dimensional form of each one of these objects was identical, pretty much, of the same door but painted with different light hitting the surface at different times of day, and the shadows were all painted. These are two examples. And you would get this idea that there was an influence of the light coming through the window, and you would see the leaves of trees and blinds, etc. And so there was a seriality that happened in the show just because each form was identical over and over again, and you got this sense of a repeating form. But what started to happen in some of the works was that I began to create that seriality that was happening across works, also within individual works. So some of the doors began to be have multiplied 2 or 3 images of the same door overlapping each other on the single panel. Like this one, which has a mirror image of itself overlapping itself. And this got me thinking about ways to treat artworks that might take the natural world as its referent rather than the man-made world in a similar way. And that led me to this idea of the scrolling cast. And what the scrolling cast represents to me is this notion of repetition of time, repetition of form, something that you might compare to the way you might revisit a place or revisit an object, either in reality or in your memory, and that each time there are elements that are identical to what it was before, but also small changes in the details that are different. And that's something that happens throughout this show too. So for instance, in Repeater, this one is cast from a California live oak, and it's the same tree 3 times, and each one is pretty much identical to the other, but as you look closely, you'll find differences in the form, and it might feel like revisiting the same tree on 3 different days, or you know, the very subtle changes that happen as you look at it, or every time you revisit it in your memory.
I'm curious too. I know that you know, you just spoke to this role that seriality and repetition is playing, and specifically in this show, most of the works share a cast or a mold with one of the other works in the show, which of course speaks to the title of the exhibition as well. And I'm curious too about how you thought through those pairings and sort of what significance that duality or having the doubling means to this body of work.
Yeah, in addition to repetition happening within some of the works, almost every work in the show has a partner in some way in the show that repeats part of the original form that these things were drawn from. So for instance, this piece shares the same bark texture with the late shadow. Of course, the braided form repeats in topiary as well as in thicket. And for me, the title of the show, Waiting for the Canyon's Echo, implies this repetition and also an engagement of a human viewer in a natural landscape. And this conversation that is set up when you speak out into a canyon and wait for the echo is about an engagement with the natural landscape that involves a human presence, a repetition of form, and plein air, for instance, creates this sort of illusion of a deep space, even in this rather flat and shallow object. So this thing is only a few inches off the wall, but through the canvas in the center and the implied distant rock form on the left side of the canvas, sets up this dynamic of deep space, even in a shallow object.
And I think too, one of the great things you've been able to accomplish with this body of work that you began exploring in the door paintings, but I think have really fleshed out in an amazing way here, is that feeling of atmosphere and that feeling of the sculpture or the work sort of extending beyond its physical boundaries and implying a space beyond itself. And that's certainly true of plein air, which we see here on the screen. But maybe you could talk about that sort of as it extends to the rest of the show as well.
Sure. You know, one of the starting points for each of these works is taking a mold, and in some way that's like taking an extraction from the natural landscape or from the objects that you're referencing, and it's almost like cutting out a piece of the natural world. and bringing it into the studio or into the gallery. And so one of my drives in this work is to be able to have that small referent to a larger space and treat it in such a way that the viewer is compelled to expand on this small extraction and imagine a larger space, imagine the space that this original object came from or was a part of, and build a larger space in their mind beyond the edges of the artwork itself. And in this one, I'm also trying to get this sense of atmosphere so that you get a sense of weather or light at the end of day. The haze from the city, if you're up in the mountains looking down at Los Angeles. And these are all things that are really sort of difficult to pin down as a physical object. And that's one of the challenges and pleasures for me of making artwork, is being able to point towards these things that aren't physical experiences, but that you can point to through physical objects.
I think, Michael, actually this, you referenced how far this work comes off the wall, but I think these details on the sides of the works, particularly the ones with the rock faces or the rock casts, give so much information to the viewer actually about this sort of tension that you're creating between the heaviness of the piece and, or like the appearance of this weight versus sort of the lightness of the actual object, and also what the kind of space that's like being created in the work. And I'm curious about those choices, giving the viewer that information with the reveal on the side. Like, can you talk a little bit about that? I'm just curious.
Sure. In pieces like this, where you see that wood frame on the side, for me, there's a special delight in that moment where you might think that a thing is an actual rock on the wall, and you go around to the side and realize that it's a thin, hollow shell. And giving that away is kind of exciting to me, because it breaks the illusion, and even as it breaks the illusion, it gives the viewer new questions. What is this object made of, and how did it come to be here? If it's not a rock, what is it? So it's both about breaking a fantasy by revealing itself, but then also perhaps prompting new questions.
I think there's a wonderful connection between the last work that was on the screen, Plein Air, and Late Shadow here, that kind of extends again to a number of the works in the show. And that is, to my knowledge, a departure from your earlier work, which is this amazing breaking of the rectangle and of that form, and of the canvas sort of dissolving on the wall like this. And maybe you could talk about the use of geometric forms as they've sort of so dramatically been juxtaposed to the more organic forms, and how that's kind of come to fruition in this body of work especially.
Sure. The rectangle is a consistent convention within painting and even within sculpture, but it's often feels like a real push to try to contain these natural forms within a rectangular shape. And for me, the pleasure of this body of work has been dealing with the idea of the rectangle, but also pushing against it. So in a work like this, there's a cutout negative space that is rectangular from this form that is less constrained by that shape. And then this shadow or implied shadow is in direct dialogue with that rectangle. Lots of this work deals with that idea of the rectangle without completely being boxed in, if you will, by the rectangle. In fact, I don't think any of these works in the show adhere to a clean rectangle. They either break through it or dispense with it altogether. And that's been an exciting thing for me, because as somebody coming from, this work is in some ways colliding painting and sculpture. And to be able to dispense with the rectangle, even as the work engages with it, adds for new possibilities and lets things like, for instance, in this work, internal clock, lets a rectangular form be influenced by these circular forms coming in and out of it. And when you look at this piece from the side, there are these slits that are larger than just the amount of the circle that is passing through it, in a way implying that there's space enough for this entire object to come in and out of the side of the work. And it engages the viewer to imagine the function of these objects. And you can imagine even more fully that this circle could leave the rectangle entirely. This piece, Tether, doesn't even have any of the rectangularity that some of the other works do, and is probably a good example of some of the new possibilities in my work that I've been able to reach by not feeling constrained by the rectangularity of painting.
And I think it should be noted too, just to kind of illustrate the echo theme, that disc in Tether is the cutout that we just saw in internal clock, and both of them are cast off the same rock as in plein air. So there's a wonderful continuity that I think sort of slowly emerges in the show that hopefully is apparent in the slideshow format as well.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, this piece repeats the same Monstera leaf that was in Studio Gate. And of course, the idea of the gate and the fence are repeated again in this work as well.
I'm wondering if you can speak also to the sort of the use of color. Some of the works obviously engage a palette that sort of relates back to their source material, and others completely depart from that, sort of bringing in a particularly unnatural palette. And I'm wondering how you sort of navigated those choices for the particular works.
Yeah, because all of them have this very three-dimensional and tangible relationship to their original source material, because they are molds and contain all the details and imprints of the original object, it's given me some freedom to experiment with color and other treatments of the objects in ways that take it away from the original source, while also, part of it maintains some truth to its original source. In a piece like Greenhouse, this green color really does have some sort of perhaps verbal or mental reference back to the world of plants because of its greenness, but also this particular shade and treatment of green is so glaring that in some ways it doesn't read as a natural plant material at all, and speaks perhaps more to green screen technology or this I like that reference takes you to a place of thinking about any new possibility of a new space or environment being mapped onto these images. And that's something that much of this work, perhaps touches on. It's about taking these natural references, but then being able to go someplace mentally with them that is much different from their original source. This piece, for instance, Leaflet, takes as its beginning point a cast of an anthurium leaf, but then also begins to box it into a rectangle that takes you back to the world of painting and perhaps of the page. The word leaflet describes at once the leaf itself, but also refers to like a folded piece of paper, something that you might hold in your hand and be printed on, and the leaf itself begins to fade into this white color that takes you back to the thinking about the page and a piece of paper. And so It kind of relates to the series of paintings I've done before called draft paintings, which were paintings of a single sheet of white paper. And the page is a site for possibility and a place where anything can happen, kind of exists simultaneous in this piece to an original reference of a natural object.
And I think, Michael, this leaflet is perhaps a wonderful segue into talking about your works on paper, which are installed in our viewing room in the back of the gallery. I know that they share such a wonderful connectivity to the works in the front of the gallery without sort of directly referencing them for the most part. So maybe you want to just talk about how those fit into the work.
Sure. I've been working this way for a couple of years now with these works on paper. It's a great way for me to explore new working methods, new compositional strategies, and it's informed the work greatly. So for instance, in a work like this one, the idea of these multiple kinds of forms overlapping each other, sense of transparency that exists in this one, sense of atmosphere, are all things that, although they might not get translated directly into a sculpture or painting, can inform the way I work in the world of painting and sculpture. For these works, I've been, creating for myself a huge library of colored papers and painted papers, all painted in different techniques. And then I'm able to combine them in ways that create sort of surprising relationships for me. I'm able to discover stuff through working in this way. And something like this piece, which has this blue form that reads sort of like a railing, perhaps in front of a mountain landscape. You could see this as analogous to the way that I'm putting that black fence over the green painted backdrop of greenhouse. And so while they may not have like a direct correspondent, they're not necessarily sketches or studies for works. They lead directly into the way I'm working in the sculptures and paintings. This one, for instance, certainly referencing rock forms, but the negative space of the rectangle relates to the form of plein air with the canvas integrated into the rocks.
And these works on paper too, specifically make such terrific use of the airbrush, and this one here, the way it kind of is used to almost model that 3D texture of the rock is so wonderful. Would you explain just, very briefly how you're able to achieve that? I know a lot of people wonder.
Sure. So there's a wide variety of techniques in these works, and in a piece like this, that greenish rock on the left was created by crumpling a piece of paper, spraying it with airbrush from different directions, flattening the paper, and then that the paper catches all the directionality of the spray. And I'm able to make forms that feel three-dimensional or have a sense of depth, even though they're all completely flat.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice sort of connection that I'm able to make between the works on paper and the sculptural works and their relationship to painting. I know that there's a lot of conversation that we have with visitors in the gallery about sort of how the works in the show sort of exist somewhere between painting and sculpture, sort of engage them both. And maybe it's a good place to sort of wrap up to just speak to that relationship that sort of you navigate between the two disciplines, or if you see them sort of as one sort of woven practice.
Yeah, I've always worked both in painting and sculpture, and one has always informed the other. I would make paintings that looked like proposals for sculptures, or sculptures that dealt with conventions of landscape painting, for instance. And in this recent work, I feel like I've really stopped separating in my mind the distinctions between those categories and allowing myself to use the working methods of both freely in combination in ways that I'm not necessarily thinking about the divisions of those two things, or whether what I'm making is ultimately a painting or a sculpture, but allowing myself free reign of the vocabulary that each one offers in works that both engage three-dimensionality and conventions of picture making. And it's a really freeing place for myself.
Wonderful. Any other questions, Ace?
No, I think that's sort of a lovely place to stop talking about the sort of inextricable nature of the one half of your practice from the other, and the way that it sort of coalesces in this show in such a beautiful and sensitive way. So thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, guys.